Don't open that workshop, Robert. Promise me you never will. Eleanor had said those words to me at least a dozen times over the 18 years we'd lived on that property. The old building sat at the edge of our backyard in Savannah, Georgia. Weathered gray planks and a rusted padlock, half hidden behind the magnolia tree she'd planted the spring we moved in. She called it her grandmother's old storage shed. Nothing in there worth seeing, she'd say. Just broken furniture and memory boxes I'm not ready to go through. I'd respected that. Eleanor was a private woman in certain ways, and I'd learned early in our marriage that some doors were hers alone to keep closed. I was 65 years old when she died. Pancreatic cancer, diagnosed in February, gone by October. 8 months that felt like 8 days and 8 decades, all at once. 31 years of marriage, and I was suddenly a man who didn't know how to make coffee for one person. Our 3 children came home for the funeral. Brandon flew in from Atlanta, where he ran a real estate development company he'd built from nothing, or so we believed. Melissa drove up from Charleston, sharp and composed as always, the kind of woman who could organize a grief reception and still find time to review spreadsheets. Thomas came from Raleigh, quiet and gentle the way he'd always been, the youngest of the 3 and the one most like Eleanor in temperament. They stayed 4 days, then they left, and the silence settled into the house like something permanent. 3 weeks after the funeral, I sat across from our family attorney, a measured man named Gerald Hartwell, who had handled our affairs for over a decade. He had kind eyes and the practiced calmness of someone who delivered difficult news regularly enough to have developed a method for it. He slid an envelope across his desk, Eleanor's handwriting on the front, my name. Inside the envelope was a small brass key on a chain and a folded note in her familiar cursive. When you're ready, open the workshop. Everything inside belongs to you. I'm sorry I kept this from you. The key is to the padlock. The combination to the inner lock is our anniversary date. I love you more than you ever knew. Eleanor. Gerald cleared his throat gently. Your wife updated her estate documents 18 months ago. The workshop and everything in it has been transferred to your name. She also arranged for an appraiser from a gallery in New York to contact you within the month, pending your decision to proceed. A gallery appraiser. I must have looked completely blank, because Gerald leaned forward slightly. We estimate the contents of that workshop, he said carefully, to be worth somewhere between $2 and $3 million. I drove home in a fog. I sat in the driveway for 20 minutes before I went inside. That evening I stood in the backyard looking at the old shed with its peeling paint and the magnolia casting long shadows across it. And I tried to reconcile the woman who had clipped grocery coupons and driven a 12-year-old Buick with the woman who apparently had a $2 million secret 40 yards from our back door. Why hadn't she told me? What else hadn't I known? I didn't open the workshop that night. I made myself wait until morning, because Eleanor had always said I made better decisions in daylight. The padlock clicked open on the first try. The inner door had a combination lock, and I stood there in the cool October morning, turning the dial to March 14th, the day we'd married in a small church outside Augusta. The lock released with a soft sound, and I pushed the door open. The smell hit me first. Oil paint and linseed and something faintly floral, a room that had been lived in regularly and recently. Then my eyes adjusted to the light. Every wall was covered in paintings, not stacked haphazardly the way you might store canvases, but hung deliberately, salon-style, floor-to-ceiling, dozens upon dozens of framed works in oils and acrylics and watercolor. Landscapes of the Georgia coast, the marsh light I'd watched Eleanor stare at our entire marriage. Portraits of people I half recognized and couldn't name. Abstract pieces in colors she'd worn on her hands the evenings she'd come back from the workshop claiming she'd been sorting through old boxes. A work table in the center held brushes sorted by size, palette knives, tubes of paint arranged by color family, a small space heater in the corner, a stool, an easel with an unfinished canvas still on it, a night heron standing at the edge of dark water, everything but the eye completed. She had been painting her entire life, apparently, or at least for as long as she'd had this room. I stood in the middle of it for a long time without moving. My phone rang, Brandon's name on the screen. Dad. His voice had the clipped efficiency I'd noticed more in recent years, the tone of a man who'd grown up and left warmth somewhere behind him. Melissa and I have been talking. We think we should come up this weekend and go over the estate situation together. Make sure everything is handled properly. I hadn't told any of them about the workshop yet. Gerald had only told me 3 days before. "How did you know about the estate?" I asked. "We're her children, Dad. We have a right to understand what's being distributed and how. There are 3 of us, and we think a family conversation is overdue." The line went quiet, and I stood surrounded by Eleanor's secret life, and felt something cold move through me that had nothing to do with the October air. They arrived Saturday morning, all 3 of them, Brandon and Melissa together in Brandon's black Mercedes, Thomas behind them in his old Honda. Brandon stepped out in the kind of casual clothing that still somehow looked expensive. Melissa had her laptop bag over one shoulder before she'd even closed the car door. Thomas hung back, hands in his jacket pockets, reading the situation the way he always did before walking into it. I'd made coffee and set out the chairs on the back porch. I wanted them to see the workshop from there. I wanted to watch their faces. Brandon spotted it immediately. "That the old shed?" He said it like it was an answer to something he'd already decided. "Your mother used it as a studio," I said. "A studio," Melissa repeated the word with a particular flatness. "As in an art studio." "She was a painter," I told them. "Apparently a very good one. I hadn't known the full extent of it until this week." Brandon turned to look at me with the expression I'd been dreading, the one that didn't bother pretending to be anything other than calculation. "How much are we talking, Dad?" Thomas was the only one who didn't ask about money. He walked past his brother and sister and stood at the entrance to the workshop, looking in, and I watched his face do something complicated and quiet. Gerald had already reached out to a gallery in New York that Eleanor had corresponded with. A woman named Patricia Cross was flying down Tuesday to conduct a formal appraisal. I told my children this, and what followed was the kind of conversation that makes you feel like a stranger in your own family. Brandon wanted a 3-way split of the proceeds, immediate liquidation, the works handled by his own contact in the art market rather than Eleanor's gallery. Melissa agreed with him, presenting figures on her laptop as if she'd been preparing for this meeting before she'd even arrived in Savannah. Thomas said very little. "Dad," Brandon said at one point, his voice carrying the practiced patience of someone managing an obstacle. "Mom made arrangements that were emotionally driven, not financially rational. You're 65. You need liquidity, not sentiment. Let us help you make the smart decision here." The smart decision. 31 years. And my wife's life's work was the smart decision now. I told them I needed time to review everything before making any choices. Brandon didn't like that. He said time was a factor in art markets. Melissa said something about estate taxes. Thomas said nothing. But when his siblings went inside for lunch, he stayed on the porch with me. "She used to come out here when I was little," he said quietly. "I'd see the light on in the workshop late at night. I always wondered what she was doing." I looked at him. "You never asked?" He shook his head. "She seemed happy when she came back. I didn't want to interrupt it." That was Thomas. That had always been Thomas. Patricia Cross arrived Tuesday, a composed woman in her 50s who walked through the workshop with the unhurried attention of someone who understood exactly what she was looking at. She spent 2.5 hours inside. When she came out, she sat down at my kitchen table and folded her hands. "Mr. Hartwell," she said, "your wife was a genuinely gifted artist. She'd been corresponding with our gallery for the last 4 years. We have documentation of that relationship. Several of these pieces are exceptional. Collectors we represent would be very interested in a curated showing." She named a figure that made my chest tight. The full collection, properly marketed, over time, could reach 2.8 million. A select showing in the next 6 months could generate significant interest. Eleanor had talked about this with strangers in New York. For 4 years, she had a gallery relationship, a correspondence, a plan for this work, and she'd never said a word to me. I sat with Patricia for another hour after she left the workshop, just asking questions. Eleanor had mailed slides of her work in 2019. She'd been to New York twice in years. She'd told me she was visiting a college friend in Connecticut. Patricia spoke about her with the familiarity of someone who'd been building towards something together. "She wanted to surprise you," Patricia said. "She talked about you constantly. She said she wanted it to be a gift." That night I went back to the workshop alone. I sat on the stool at the work table and looked at the unfinished heron painting on the easel. Eleanor's last one, probably. Painted in the last months of her life, when the diagnosis had made the prognosis clear. There was a small cabinet beneath the work table I hadn't opened yet. Inside, I found a leather journal with a simple latch. Her handwriting filled it, dates going back to 2005, the year Thomas had come to live with us. I sat in the dark workshop with the journal open and read things I hadn't been prepared for. What I found in those pages changed the shape of everything I thought I'd known. The first entries were about the paintings, about color and composition, and the specific quality of marshlight in January. But as the years moved forward, the entries shifted. There was a name I didn't recognize. A social worker in Raleigh named Deborah Chen. There were references to records, to correspondence, to a search that had taken 2 years. Thomas was Eleanor's biological son. She'd been 19 years old, unmarried, a girl from a modest family in rural Georgia, who had gotten pregnant with a man she'd loved briefly and completely before he'd moved on without knowing. She'd given the baby up for adoption through a private agency in 1993. She'd been 22 when we met, 24 when we married, and she'd carried that history in silence for our entire life together. In 2003, she'd hired a private investigator to find the child she'd given up. The records had taken time. When she found him, Thomas had been 9 years old, placed with a loving family in North Carolina who had struggled financially and eventually voluntarily relinquished custody. Eleanor had done something I still can barely comprehend. She had quietly arranged, through proper legal channels, and with the involvement of the social worker, to be considered as a foster family. She'd brought it to me as a simple conversation. "Do you think we have room in this house for one more?" And I'd said yes without hesitation because that was Eleanor, and that was us. Thomas had been 10 when he moved into our guest room. He'd called us Mom and Dad within a year. He'd graduated from high school, from college, from a graduate program in environmental science. He'd built a life. He didn't know. The journal made that clear. Eleanor had never told him the truth. She'd loved him first, as the child she'd found again, and then as something that had become its own thing entirely, a bond that had grown past its original shape. There was one more thing in the cabinet, a medical file. Thomas's name on the tab, kidney function panels from a nephrologist in Raleigh going back 18 months, showing a progressive decline the journal confirmed Eleanor had been tracking. She'd known Thomas was sick. She'd been tested herself and found to be a compatible donor. She'd been planning to tell both of us, after the gallery showing, after the surprise, after she'd wrapped everything in something that felt like a gift rather than a confession. Then February had come, and the diagnosis had arrived first, and Eleanor had run out of time. I sat in that workshop until 2 in the morning. When I finally stood up, my back ached and my eyes were dry and something inside me had shifted permanently. By the time Brandon and Melissa arrived the following weekend for what my son had started calling the family meeting, I'd made a few decisions of my own. I'd spent the intervening days going through the files Gerald had in storage from Eleanor's estate. She'd been meticulous. Among the documents related to the workshop and the gallery, there were other files I hadn't known existed. Correspondence, bank records, transaction records with flagged entries and handwritten notations in Eleanor's careful script. My wife, it turned out, had not only been a painter, she had also been paying very close attention to our son. Brandon's real estate development company had been running an investment structure that looked legitimate from the outside and wasn't. Eleanor had first noticed irregularities in 2021 when Brandon had asked her, casually, about the possibility of borrowing against the equity in our home for a short-term capital need in his business. She'd declined and said nothing to me, but she'd started asking quiet questions. She'd hired the same private investigator who had helped her find Thomas, an ex-federal agent named Carl Briggs who worked out of Augusta, and what Carl had documented over 14 months was detailed and damning. Brandon was using investor funds from a development project in Cobb County to cover losses in 2 other failed projects, floating money between accounts and paying early investors with later investor capital while skimming substantial fees. The scheme had been running for nearly 2 years. 13 investors, mostly retired couples, had put in a combined $4 million. The documented losses and misappropriations totaled just over $1.6 million. Melissa had known. Not all of it, not the full structure, but enough. Brandon had paid her to look the other way, running a bookkeeping arrangement through her accounting practice that gave her cover and income while making her complicit. Eleanor had Carl document that too. She'd prepared a packet. Everything organized, labeled, cross-referenced. The kind of evidence that a federal prosecutor wouldn't need to work very hard with. I'd read every page. When Brandon and Melissa arrived Saturday morning, they came with a plan. Brandon had a real estate contact who wanted to discuss representing the collection. Melissa had drafted a document formalizing the three-way split. They walked in with the particular confidence of people who believed the conversation was already over. Thomas arrived separately, as he had the week before. I asked him to come into the kitchen first, alone. I told him I needed to show him something before his siblings arrived. I set Eleanor's journal on the table between us and opened it to the page I'd marked. He read slowly. He didn't speak for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were wet, but his expression was something I can only describe as a man finding solid ground after years of walking on something that had always shifted slightly beneath him. "She was my mother," he said, not as a question. "She was," I told him, "from before you were born, and every day after. Did she ever think about telling me?" "Every day," I said. "I believe that completely." He was quiet again for a moment. Then he said, "I've been sick." "I know," I told him. I found the file. He looked down at his hands. "I haven't told anyone. I didn't want to be a burden. I've been managing it, but it's getting harder to manage. There's someone I need to tell you about," I said. Brandon and Melissa had helped themselves to coffee and settled at the dining room table by the time Thomas and I joined them. Patricia Cross had provided me with a formal letter of interest for the collection. I'd also asked Gerald to be present, and he sat quietly in the corner with a notepad. Brandon began before I'd even sat down. "Dad, we've been patient, but it's time to make some concrete decisions here. The collection, the property, all of it. We have a structure that makes financial sense, and we need your agreement to move forward." I let him finish. Then I opened the folder I'd placed on the table before they'd arrived. I slid the first set of documents to Tom Beaumont, a financial fraud investigator Gerald had referred me to, who had quietly accompanied Patricia Cross during her second visit to verify the documentation Carl Briggs had assembled. Tom had flown in from Atlanta that morning. "Brandon," I said, "I'd like Mr. Beaumont to walk you through what he's reviewed." The color left Brandon's face before Tom said a single word. What followed was not a negotiation. Brandon's lawyer, whom he called in a panic from the driveway 40 minutes later, took one look at the documentation and advised his client to say very little. Melissa, to her credit, didn't pretend. She sat at the table with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes focused on the middle distance and didn't try to argue or deflect. When she finally spoke, she said only, "I knew it was wrong. I knew it the whole time. The investors' names were in the file. Retired teachers, a former county engineer and his wife, a woman who'd sold her late husband's hardware store and trusted Brandon with the proceeds. Real people with real losses, documented and totaled." "Brandon," I said quietly, "your mother spent 14 months making sure those people could get their money back. That's what the documentation is for. That's what the evidence is for. You can cooperate with the investigators and help make them whole, or you can find out what happens when you don't." He looked at me across the table with an expression I didn't fully recognize on my son's face. Something that might have been shame, or might have just been fear dressed in its clothes. I chose to believe it was shame, because Eleanor would have, and that seemed like the better instinct to follow. They left that afternoon, both of them, with very different plans than the ones they'd arrived with. Thomas stayed. We sat on the back porch as the sun went down over the magnolia, the workshop door standing open behind us, Eleanor's paintings visible in the warm interior light I'd left on. I told him about his biological father. Carl Briggs had found him 18 months ago, when Eleanor had been testing donors in preparation for a conversation she'd never gotten to have. His name was Arthur Devlin. He was 57 years old. He'd grown up in Augusta, moved to Macon in his 30s, worked for 30 years as a civil engineer, married, had one daughter in college. He'd had no idea Eleanor had been pregnant. He'd been tested without his knowledge through a sample Eleanor had arranged through creative means I didn't entirely understand, but entirely believe she'd managed to pull off, because that was Eleanor and she thought 3 steps ahead of everyone. Arthur was a match, a near-perfect match. "He doesn't know about you yet," I told Thomas. "But your mother believed he would want to know. She believed he'd want to help." Thomas looked out at the magnolia for a long time. "How do you feel about all of this?" he asked finally. "About her keeping it. About me being who I am." I thought about that. I thought about it honestly. "I feel like she trusted me to handle the truth," I said. "She knew that about me. that I'd need time, but I'd get there. He nodded slowly. You're my son, I told him. That's been true since you were 10 years old and slept on that twin bed in the guest room with a flashlight because you were afraid of the dark but too proud to say so. Nothing in that journal changed that. It just explained some things I hadn't needed explained to love you. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did I. We sat in the kind of quiet that doesn't need filling. I called Arthur Devlin on a Tuesday morning, standing in Eleanor's workshop surrounded by her paintings. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say and then abandoned the rehearsal and just talked. I told him who I was. I told him about Eleanor, and what she'd found, and what she'd arranged, and who Thomas was. I told him about the kidney disease. The line was very quiet for a long time. Then Arthur said, I knew Eleanor Hartwell. I haven't thought about her in 35 years, but I knew her. I know, I said. She was a remarkable woman, he said. Even then, she was, I agreed. He flew to Savannah 2 weeks later. I'd offered to arrange a meeting at the house, but Arthur had said he'd like somewhere neutral, somewhere neither of us had history with. We met at a coffee shop off Abercorn Street, a place with good light and outdoor tables and no particular significance. He was a tall man with a quiet way about him that reminded me, painfully and not unpleasantly, of Thomas. He ordered black coffee and sat with his hands around the cup and listened to everything I told him. I have a daughter, he said when I'd finished. She's 22. She doesn't know about this. I need to talk to her before anything else. Of course, I said. But I want to meet him, Arthur said. I want Thomas to know that whatever he needs, I'm here. The compatibility testing came back in 10 days. Arthur was a match. Thomas's medical team at Emory coordinated with Arthur's physician in Macon, and the surgery was scheduled for the new year, 3 months out. In the meantime, I did something Eleanor had planned to do herself. Patricia Cross arranged a showing at her gallery in New York in early December. 32 of Eleanor's paintings, selected together by Patricia and me over several evenings in the workshop with coffee going cold and the night they're on canvas watching from the easel. The showing sold out in 3 weeks. Patricia called me from the gallery the night of the opening to tell me that people had stood in front of Eleanor's marsh paintings and wept, that collectors were asking about her, wanting to know her story, wanting more. I stood in our backyard and looked at the workshop with its lights on and felt her there. Not in the way grief makes you feel someone, not the hollow shape of absence, but something warmer. She'd made that room, she'd made all of it. She'd carried secrets I might have wished she'd shared, but I understood now why she'd kept them the way she had. She'd been building something that would outlast her and be there when it was needed. Thomas met Arthur for the first time at our kitchen table on a Sunday afternoon in November. I made coffee and then decided I wasn't supposed to be in the room for that conversation, so I went out to the back porch and let them have it. I could hear the low murmur of voices through the window. I couldn't hear the words, and I didn't try. Whatever was said in that kitchen was theirs, not mine. I sat with my coffee and looked at the magnolia and at the workshop and at the low gray November sky, and I let myself feel something I hadn't let myself feel in a long time. Grateful. That was it. I was grateful. Brandon and Melissa had both spoken with Gerald's referral, a federal mediator who specialized in investor restitution cases. The process was difficult and ongoing, as these things are. Brandon surrendered his real estate licenses voluntarily and entered into a structured repayment agreement with the investors. Melissa cooperated fully and faced her own professional consequences. Neither of those things was painless or simple. Neither of those things meant the damage was undone. But Eleanor's documentation had given 13 families a clear path to recovering what they'd lost, and that had been her intention. She'd been protecting them too, in her way. Protecting people she'd never met from harm her own son was causing, because she thought about consequences and she believed in accountability. I still think about that. About the kind of person who carries something like that quietly, who investigates her own child and builds a case against him not out of cruelty but out of a belief that love doesn't mean looking away. I think I knew who she was. I think you always know, somewhere. Thomas's surgery was in January. Arthur Devlin donated a kidney to a son he'd only known for 2 months in a hospital in Atlanta on a cold Thursday morning while I sat in the waiting room with Catalina with Melissa, who had come not because anyone asked her to, but because she'd decided to show up differently than she had before. We didn't talk much. We drank bad hospital coffee and watched the clock, and when the surgeon came out to tell us Thomas was stable and doing well, Melissa put her face in her hands and cried in a way that had nothing to do with money or schemes or anything she'd built or lost. She cried the way you cry when something you almost let yourself destroy turns out to still be there. I put my hand on her shoulder. She let me. Arthur sat with us in recovery. This man I barely knew who was now threaded into my family in ways I was still understanding. He'd brought his daughter, a young woman named Claire, who had Eleanor's kind of steady directness, and she sat beside her father and occasionally looked at Thomas with the expression of someone recalibrating what family means. I know what it means. I've known for a long time. I just hadn't always been able to say it clearly. Family is the choice you make on the ordinary days. It's the stool in a secret workshop and the flashlight under a guest room door and the key on a chain that opens something you weren't ready for until you were. It's two people sitting on a back porch not saying anything because nothing needs to be said. Eleanor knew that. She'd known it her whole life, and she'd built her whole life around it, painting marsh light in a room no one else was allowed into, keeping a secret not because she didn't trust me, but because she was still shaping it into something she could give. I have her paintings now. The collection that didn't sell is hung throughout the house, in the hallways, in the kitchen, in the room where Thomas used to sleep with his flashlight. The unfinished heron is still on the easel in the workshop. I can't bring myself to move it. Sometimes I go in there in the mornings with my coffee and sit on her stool and look at it. The heron with no eye, standing at the edge of dark water. I think she knew what she was doing, leaving it that way. I think she was leaving me something to finish, in whatever sense I was able. I'm 65 years old, and my wife is gone, and my sons are two men putting their lives back together. One of them from illness, and one of them from the version of himself he became when he stopped being afraid. My daughter's learning to be the person she was underneath the choices she made. Somewhere in Macon, a man named Arthur is explaining to his daughter how the past works, how it doesn't stay where you put it, how sometimes it comes forward to ask something of you, and the only question is whether you're the kind of person who shows up. Eleanor knew the answer to that question about me, even when I didn't. She always did. If you've been carrying a secret in this family that love requires honesty about, I hope this story gave you something. I hope it gave you the courage to open the door you've been standing in front of. I spent 31 years married to a woman who was painting in a workshop 40 yards from where I slept, and I didn't know, and the truth is that what she was making in there was the most important thing she ever gave me. She just needed time to make it worth giving. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, and that family is not the same as blood. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and what family lesson has stayed with you the longest. I read everyone.